How you doing today? Today our job's going to be changing an axle shaft on a 98 Tercel. It's a very typical axle shaft change, nothing really fancy here. It's similar on almost every kind of make and model of car out there. Like many higher mileage cars, this one, the rubber boot split, so all the grease came out and the shaft inside started to wear. And usually the first thing you notice from a driving standpoint is a knocking when you're turning. What you can do if you're trying to determine if the drive shaft is shot or not is if you drive in a parking lot and make a figure eight, hard to the left, hard to the right, hard to the left, hard to the right, and you notice a knocking as you're turning. If you turn full left and you hear knocking, it's usually your left drive shaft that's going. If you steer to the right, it's usually the right drive shaft that's going. In either case, if the boot's broken, at the very minimum you're going to have to replace the boot. But nowadays the cost of changing the boot is almost the same price as buying a replacement drive shaft. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to replace the drive shaft as a complete unit. In this particular case, it's a 1998. This car does not have ABS brakes. Some of them did have the option of ABS brakes. The new drive shaft that we're going to be putting in has what they call a reluctor wheel here for the ABS sensor. Okay. And from what I have been reading, this could damage the inside of the hub if the car was did not come equipped with ABS. So when we get to that stage where we have it apart, we're going to check to see if there is in fact interference between this ring and the hub. If so, we can knock that ring off, get it out of the way. Of course, if your car does have ABS, you want to make sure the ring is there, that your supplier gave you a drive shaft with the ABS ring. Okay. You'll notice on the inside side of the drive shaft, there is a little clip. That's what holds it into the transmission, or into the differential, beg your pardon. This part slides in, and the clip is what actually holds it in place. Okay. When it's time to take it out, you have to push it out. Sometimes a large screwdriver or a pry bar is required to get it to come out. Other times it comes out a little bit easier. I've gotten them out in 10 seconds, and I've spent half an hour trying to get them out. It just seems like a luck of the draw type of thing. On the other side, we have a similar spline on the shaft and a threaded end, which is going to be held on with a nut that must be torqued to spec. It's 160 foot-pounds in this case. Make sure you have a torque wrench. Okay, and there's a hole in the drive shaft there where the cotter pin's going to go through. Okay. If you look at this, this is what the drive shaft is supposed to look like. Nice, new, shiny rubber boots there. We're going to show you now what the old one looks like and why it needs replacing. So here's the rubber boot. You can see that it's broken. You see the grease is slimed all over the underside, on the back of the tie rod. Hopefully not on the brake itself. That would be bad. Okay, but definitely that boot is broken. The inside one is not broken, but let's say we're going to change the whole thing anyways, so we won't have to worry about that. Okay, so we're going to take the nut off the end of the drive shaft. It's held in with a cotter pin. Okay, and a little metal, kind of a castle arrangement. Okay, it's a 30mm nut in this case. It's already been loosened before we started the video. Okay. If when you go to loosen this, if you have an impact gun, you can usually just knock it off with the impact gun. If you're going to use a bar like this, sometimes you need a pipe as well because they're really tight. You'll probably need your friend to stand on the brake pedal. So if you are alone and you don't have somebody who can stand on the brake pedal for you, if you put a pry bar in between the wheel studs like that, with the one end touching the ground, then when you put your pressure on it, the pry bar will stop it from rotating. Okay, so whether you use an impact, a bar, a friend, helper, or by yourself, one way or another, you got to get that nut off of there. Okay. Okay. Now again, this car has had a fair bit of maintenance done on it over the years, and I put anti-seize grease on the splines from the drive shaft in the past when I was doing a wheel bearing. Sometimes you'll find when you go to take this shaft off, it's stuck. You can't get it to go. So if you hammer on it, you can usually drive the drive shaft in a bit. Okay. Sometimes it takes a lot of convincing, sometimes a little bit of WD-40. It will come off with persistence. Be careful I always leave the nut on so that we don't accidentally damage the thread if you're going to be reusing the drive shaft. If the drive shaft is garbage anyways, it doesn't matter if you damage the thread. But if you're going to be putting the drive shaft back in, if your story is simply that you're going to change the boots on it, then make sure you don't damage the threads. Okay? So the next step is to take off the lower ball joint. In this car it's very simple. There's just 3 bolts that you would have seen in that still shot just a moment ago. By loosening the lower ball joint, we'll be able to move the hub enough to get the axle in. Okay? So now we're going to use the pry bar to push the lower control arm down and away from the ball joint. Okay, we just pry it between the frame and the... Oops. Okay, so the ball joint is free. There we go. Maybe you can get a shot in from behind there. Okay, and show how the... Okay. Okay, so we got the lower ball joint separated from the control arm. Now we're going to be able to turn the wheel, and the drive shaft, as you saw, came out of the hub. It's now free. Okay. Last step is to pull the drive shaft out of the differential side. When you do this, you're going to lose the fluid from the differential. Okay. I've read online, I'm going to try for the first time now, by tilting the car all the way to one side, we might not lose the fluid, and I'm pretty confident we won't lose all the fluid, but we may lose some. I'm going to put a bucket under there just in case. Okay, so it did give us a bit of a battle. It took 2 of us about 5-6 minutes to get it out, but now you can see exactly what's going on in there. Okay. This one still has some grease in it, but it was knocking already, and like I said, the cost of replacing the boots and putting new grease in is about the same price as a completely rebuilt shaft or even a new shaft. We picked up the new ones for $48 Canadian, which is about $35 American. So not a very expensive ordeal anymore. It's probably just wise to change it out. Okay. Okay, well, it looks like our friend online was correct. The fellow in Toyota Nation mentioned that the reluctor ring would touch the hub. It actually touches the hub seal, the inner hub seal, and it is definitely too big. It would grind. So good call on that. Glad we read it before we started. It simply taps off. We just used a punch and tapped it around a dozen times until it came off. Good call. Okay, now we also had a small oil leak from the differential where the drive shaft goes into the differential. Didn't lose much, but we thought while we're at it, we're going to put the new seal in there. We got one from Toyota. It's a little bit on the expensive side. It was $26 Canadian, so a bit expensive, but it's an OEM original. Probably good for the rest of the life of the car. If you have a large socket, or in this case I'm just using an old wheel bearing race, you set it over the seal and tap on it with the hammer to drive it into the casing. Okay, so you can use a seal puller or a screwdriver to get the old one out. Just put that in there, tap it in until it's all the way in. Okay, this should be flush with the housing. We'll show you when we got it put in there. Okay. There you go. There's the old one. Okay, so we got the new seal positioned. We're just going to use the old piece of the wheel bearing, carefully tapping around the outside, trying to make sure we drive it in nice and square. You go around the diameter, gently tapping until it's in all the way. If it starts to go crooked, stop and tap on the opposite side from where it's gone crooked. Okay. Almost in, just a little bit more. We want it just flush with the housing, the same way the old one was when we took it out. Okay, there we go. So it's nice and smooth all the way around. No, it's sticking out a little bit more on this side, so I'll tap that side a bit more. There we go. Nice and smooth all the way around. Insert the new drive shaft. I got my son helping, holding the brake out of the way. Be careful when you're putting it in. You don't want any dirt or anything getting on that spline shaft. Okay. Careful not to pinch the seal as you put in the drive shaft. Wiggle it back and forth until the splines line up. You'll feel it as soon as it lines up. And then usually a good push will get it to lock in. Usually. There we go. Okay, so she locked in. Now, I like to use anti-seize on everything because that way I can take it apart again in 5 or 10 years when it needs doing again. Hopefully this drive shaft will last the life of the car, but just in case we're going to put some anti-seize on the spline so we can get it out later. Okay, so there we go, a little bit of anti-seize so it doesn't stick. When we go to put it back together, the shaft should slide into that spline very smoothly. I've heard people having problems getting it in there and they just put the nut on it and rammed it in with an impact gun. Big mistake. If it doesn't slide in properly, it's not lined up properly. Take your time, get it lined up right. So it just slid right in. That's the way it's supposed to be. Okay. They provide you with a new nut. I would strongly suggest you use the new one. The old one might be damaged. We'll be torquing that later on. For now I'm just putting it on finger tight. Some cars will have a washer and a nut. This one just has a shouldered nut. Just fine. Okay. Next we're going to reattach the lower ball joint. Again, I'm going to put a little anti-seize on the bolts so that we don't have problems in the future if we have to change that ball joint or connecting or control arm or whatever in the future. Okay, so we're just using the pry bar to push down the control arm. We'll put the ball joint, line it up, start the bolt. In this case it's 1 bolt and 2 nuts. Always a good plan to get all the bolts in place first before you tighten anything. Go. Okay. You can use the torque wrench if you really want to, but just good and tight is what it needs. Okay, so ball joint back on. Now we're at the last stage, which is tightening down the wheel nut. Okay, so we've tightened it as far as we can by hand. Okay, the car's in neutral, so the wheel is turning freely. In this case, it's an automatic with 1 wheel on the ground, so simply putting it in park will stop the wheel from turning. Or again, you can have a friend step on the brake or use your bar to hold it from turning. Okay, it's in park? Yeah. Okay. Okay, the new nut is also a 30 mil, that's easy. Get out your torque wrench, set it for 160. You're going to make sure if you're using a different year or model of car that you look up the specification. It is a lot, but some torque wrenches don't go up to 160. You may have to buy a new torque wrench or borrow one from a friend. Okay, there you go. It clicked. It's locked. And finally, we got to put our cotter pin back in. There's the hole. Thankfully, it lines up. If it is not quite lined up, sometimes you have to monkey with it a little bit, make it a little tighter. Don't make it much looser, obviously, but a little tiny bit tighter is good. Fortunately, this one didn't come with the new cotter pin, but the old one wasn't bad. since it was just changed when we did the wheel bearings a few months ago. There you go, cotter pins in place. Job is done, just got to put your tire on, take her for a road test, make sure it's okay. The trick of jacking up the one side of the car so the fluid didn't leak out was a good trick. It worked perfectly in this case. If yours does lose fluid when you pull the drive shaft, make sure you top up the differential. A lot of cars, the differential is a separate part from the transmission, even though the casing looks like it's all one unit. It's not. It has separate compartments inside, so make sure you didn't drain out the fluid from the differential part of your transmission. I hope this helped you. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
I can just edit this part out.
Yeah.
I was just edit this part out.
You don't need to be adjusted.
Next video, how to adjust a torque wrench.
Oh, yeah.